Welcome viewers. In this video, we will be finding out how to solve the square root of 128,881 without using a calculator. We will be finding out how to establish the square root of 128,881 without using a calculator. Take note that 128,881 is a perfect square. Now, what do we mean by a perfect square? What do we mean by a perfect square? A perfect square is simply a positive integer obtained by multiplying an integer by itself. What do we mean by integer? Integer is simply a whole number. A whole number. And that whole number could be positive, negative, or even zero. So when we talk about an integer, we're talking about a whole number, and that whole number could either be positive, negative, or even zero. That tells you and me that it is not a fraction and it doesn't have a decimal. So we say a perfect square is a positive integer. Take note that in this particular case, we are talking about a perfect square as being a positive integer, but it's obtained by multiplying an integer by itself. That is, the integer multiplying itself could either be positive or negative, but the end result is a positive integer, and that positive integer is the perfect square. Let's look at examples. You see that 8 times 8 is equals to 64. 8 times 8 is 64, so 64 is the positive integer and is the perfect square. 7 times 7 is 49. You see that 49 is positive, it's a whole number, and it's obtained by multiplying another integer that is a whole number by itself. Now you have minus 4 times minus 4. So your perfect square is the positive integer, so it's a positive whole number. But it's obtained by multiplying an integer by itself. In this case, you have an integer which is a whole number. Remember we said an integer can either be positive or negative. So here we have a negative integer that is negative whole number, which is multiplying itself to get 16. And that 16 is a positive integer. Once again, you have 4 times 4 this time around. This is a positive integer multiplying itself, that is another positive integer, in order to get the positive integer, which is the perfect square. So this is the perfect square, that is 64. 49 is also a perfect square. 16 is also a perfect square. Now, why are we talking about this perfect square? We're talking about this perfect square because we want to find out what the square root of a perfect square. That means, for instance, if we have 64 and we want to find the square root will simply be 8. That is, what number multiplies itself in order to give 64. If we want to find out the square root of 49, for instance, we want to find out what is that number that multiplies itself in order to give 49. Here we have 7. Now, we are looking at this 16. and 16 is a perfect square. So what number will you multiply by itself in order to give you 16? You see that in this case you have minus 4 times minus 4 and you get 16, and positive 4 times positive 4 and you get 16. So we can clearly see that the square root of a number is either the positive or negative value of the square root. So square root of 16 is either positive 4 or minus 4. Now, what we're trying to do is to find out the square root of a perfect square. So we have been given out the number, and we have 128,881. So we want to find out what number will you multiply by itself that gives you 128,881. So our first step is to write out the number, that is the perfect square, which is 128,881. But we will be writing it out without the commas. Our next step is to group in twos from the right hand side. We will be grouping this number in twos from the right hand side. Now what did we just do? So our number is 128,881. We have 128,881. So what we are doing is that we group it in twos from the right. So you count from the right, 1, 2. So you put your comma here. Then you count again, 1, 2. And then you put your comma here. So that's why we have the commas are shown here, and then the other comma are shown here. Like I said, you count 1, 2, then you put your comma, then you count again 1, 2, and then you put your comma, and of course 1, 2. That's why you have 12, 88, and then 81. Now our third step is to commence long division, as we will be explaining. We will be carrying out a long division and we will explain the procedure. So what we will do now is to carry out the long division of our number as grouped. Remember, we have 128,881, but you also remember that we agreed that we will group it in twos from the right, and that's what we have as can be seen. Now what we will do next is, let's look at this first number here, which is 12. We look at the number as it is grouped. We look at the first two numbers, which is 12. What number do we multiply by itself in order to get 12? Or a number that is slightly less than 12, but definitely it must not be more than 12. Now if we look at 2 times 2 is 4, that's quite far away. If we look at 3 times 3, that is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. So 4 times 4 is out of it. So the nearest will be 3 times 3, which is 9. So we have our 3 times 3, and we have 9. So the next thing is to subtract 12 minus 9, and then we have 3. So we have subtracted. Now what we do is we will bring down the next two digits, and that is 88. So we'll bring it down to the 3, and then therefore we now have 388. Now the next step is to look at these 3 above. These 3 above, we will double it. 3 times 2 is 6, or doubling 3 is 6. Therefore, we'll put the 6 on the left-hand side. Now, we will ask ourselves, what number do we put on top? And then by the 6, that is here. And then also here, what number do we put here? That when we multiply it, it gives us either 388 or something slightly less than 388. So if we use 4, for instance, so that means if it is 4 and then we multiply it by 64, that gives us what? 4 times 4, 16, carry 1, 4 times 6, 24, plus 1, that's 25. So let's try putting 5 there. So we have 5, and then we say times 65. What do we have? 5 times 5, 15. No, 5 times 5, 25. 5 times 6, 30, plus 2, 325. So let's try using 5. Looks like a closer figure to use. So if we put 5 there and 5 here, so that becomes 5 times 65, which we have calculated here to be 325. So let's subtract 388 minus 325. 8 minus 5, we have 3, and then 8 minus 2, we have 6. So we have 63. So the next thing is to, after we have subtracted, we have 63, is to bring down the 81. So you bring down the values as paired in twos. So what we now have is 6381. Now what do we do again? We have 35 on top here. Go to the top, you see where we have 35. So this 35 on top, we will double it. 35 times 2 is 70. So we put the 70 here, as you can see. And then we'll now consider what number do we put there and also on top, such that when we multiply it, we will get 6381. So if we put a 9 there, and we also put a 9, that is 709 times 9, and that gives us 6381. So 6381 minus 6381 at the bottom there is 0. So therefore our answer is plus or minus 359. So we see that the entire value we have on top is 359. And our square root is usually the positive or negative value, and we have plus or minus 359. So it is therefore 359 or minus 359, and that is the square root of 128,881. Thank you for watching this video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share.